Hello and namaste everyone. Today we are with the another interesting video of Alireza Firouzja and Anish Giri. Alireza Firouzja, who just was leading the Tata Steel Masters Chess Championship 2019, lost his round 4 game with Wesley So, and again he won a game with Anish Giri. He is again leading the tournament along with the Wesley So. Here Alireza Firouzja is white whereas Anish Giri is black. The first move that was played by Alireza Firouzja is d4. The first move that was played is d4. Queen's game, Queen's pawn game. d5 was replied by Anish Giri. c4 Queen's Gambit was played in the game. e6 Queen's Gambit declined was replied by Anish Giri. If you don't know how to play Queen's Gambit accepted, then you should not capture the pawn on the c4, because if you capture the pawn on c4, you'll be in a big trouble if you don't know how to play. So for example, after pawn captures c4, then e3, and if defends the pawn, then a4, and if again defends the pawn, then pawn captures b5, and if pawn captures b5, then there is immediate loss with queen to f3 attacking the rook, which is not defended, and it's immediate loss for black. So if you don't know how to play Queen's Gambit accepted, then you should not capture the pawn immediately while your opponent gives the pawn on the c4 in the opening. So it's pawn's gambit decline in the board. e6 was played by Anish Giri. Knight to c3 was replied by white. Bishop to e7, normal piece development again. C takes d5, here exchange was done by white. E takes d5 was played in the game. Bishop to f4, keeping the eye on the diagonal from b8 to h2 square. c6, protecting the pawn on the d5. Queen to c2, here white might be planning for anti-castle and keeping the eye on the h7 and not letting black to develop his bishop on the f5. Here queen to c2 is simply not letting black to develop his bishop on the f5. Knight to f6, black is planning and moving towards the castle. e3 was played in the game, waiting for the other move like bishop to f1, developing bishop to f1, and knight on the g1. Knight to h5 attacks the bishop. Bishop goes to e5. If bishop was not played on the e5, then knight captures on the f4, and there will be isolated pawn d4 and f4. That's why white played bishop to e5 here. And if black plays f6, and then there will be weak square for black g6. Another thing is that knight will not have any square for his move. Knight to d7 was played, and after bishop to e2, giving up his bishop pair. Knight captures bishop, and black accepts the bishop pair, the bishop on the e7 and the bishop on the c8. Now black has a bishop pair, but it has some advantage of the knight on the h5. D captures e5, down knight on the h5 doesn't have any place for his move. g6 was played, and after bishop captures h5 was played. Black has a bishop pair on the e7 and c8, but he has many weakened square. He have three isolated pawn here. The pawn on the f7, the pawn on the h7, and the pawn on the h5 all are isolated, and because of this, black is not in the good position. Knight to g2 was played. f6, trying to exchange one isolated pawn. E captures f6 was played, then bishop capture f6, not letting white to have an extra pawn on the center, and also developing his bad bishop to a good square bishop. Rook to d1 was played, pinning the pawn. Castle, and castle was done. Here white has a safe king, whereas black has unsafe king because of the pawn on the h7 and the pawn on the h5. Because of this, black king is unsafe, whereas white king is safe. King to h8 was played, trying to safeguard his king, putting his king on the h8, since that the bishop on the f6 can go back to the g7 and guard the king later on. e4 was then played. d4 was replied because of the pawn captures on the d5, and then after knight captures on the d5 could be played. If bishop comes on the e6 to protect the pawn. Then also, even if bishop comes to the e6 to protect the pawn, then there will be e captures. And then after, if pawn captures, then of course knight on the f4 is coming up, attacking the bishop, and then attacking the bishop, and again attacking the pawn, which will lead black to have a pawn down. That's why here e5 was played in the game. Knight to f4, bishop to e5 was then played. Knight d3 was played. If pawn captures the knight, then simply there will be knight captures on the bishop, and it attacks the queen, which will lead white to capture the pawn back and win a pawn, and also attacks the king on the h8. That's why here pawn captures knight is not possible, whereas bishop to g7 was played in the game. After knight to e2, knight is defended and attacks the pawn on the d4. h4 was then played, not letting knight to come on the g3. As 3 was played. Also, black might come on the g4, pinning the knight on the e2. That's why here s3 was played by Alireza Firouzja. Queen to e7 was played, attacks the pawn on the e4, which was protected by e5, giving up the pawn on the e5. But it was for a short period of a time. It also attacks the pawn on the d4. Rook to d8 was played. At first, black just protects the pawn on the d4. f4 was played. Instead of rook to d8, if bishop captures to e5, then knight captures on the e5, and if queen captures on the e5, then rook captures the pawn on the d4, giving up the center's pawn and attacks the pawn on the h4. Yes, of course, this position is far better for white rather than rook to d8. So here, bishop captures e5 was not played in the game, not giving up the bishop on the e5, then because the bishop on the g7 is protecting the king. Instead of bishop captures on the e5, rook to d8 was played, protecting the pawn on the d4 and not giving up the strong bishop on the g7, which is guarding the king on the h8 square. So here rook to d8 was replied by black. f4 protects the pawn on the e5. Now it's giving the center square for white rather than black. Here black cannot push the pawn on the c5 because queen captures the pawn on the c5, and again b6 is not possible because queen captures on the c6 is possible, which will lead of course white to win a pawn and win the game as well. Bishop to f5 was played, pinning the knight on the d3 square. Yes, white doesn't have a pair of bishop, but again white is winning the position because of the center squares. It has a lot of square advantage. The d6 square, the f6 square, the bishop on the g7 doesn't have a good square to move, and it's becoming bad and bad. King to h2 was played. Queen e6 was applied. Knight g1, knight is coming on the f3 and will attack the pawn on the h4, and again attacks the pawn on the d4. Then after bishop to h6 was played, attacking the pawn on the f4. Even after that, knight to f3 was played by white, giving up the pawn on the f4. Because of his great understanding, Firouzja gave up a pawn on the f4. Because of the active knight, he gave up the pawn on the f4, but it was not captured by black. Instead, he protects the pawn on the h4. What happens if Anish Giri captures the pawn on the f4? Let's see what happens. If he captures the pawn on the f4, then there will be immediate loss for black. If you haven't seen it, you can pause the video and find out the best move. If black captures the pawn on the f4, then yes, of course, if you have seen knight captures f4, then you are great. Knight captures f4, then bishop captures c2, then knight captures on the e6, then if bishop captures d1, then knight captures d8, and yes, of course, white is a piece up. Bishop captures on the f3, then there will be knight check, and if king comes on the g7, then there will be rook captures on the f3, and white will be a piece up. Winning this will be a win game for white. So here bishop captures on the f4 is not possible. That's why here black didn't capture on the f4. Instead, he moved his queen to e7, guarding the pawn on the h4. King to h1 was played. Bishop captures f4 is now played by black. Now here knight captures on the f4 is not possible, because if knight captures on the f4 then lead black to win our queen. It was the planning for black such that black can capture the pawn on the f4. Even though it's not winning for black, still the pawn on the e5 and the active knight on the f3 is making white have the equal position and win the pawn on the d4 now. Queen to c5 was played in the game. Queen captures c5 is the first move, because after that, if he do not captures on the c4, then knight captures on the f4 is coming up, leading a piece up. Knight captures on the c5 here, the pawn on the d4 is hanging, the pawn on the h4 is hanging, and again the pawn on the b7 is also hanging. So here none of the pawn can be defended. So here bishop to c2 was played, attacking the rook. Rook captures to the d4, rook captures d4, and then after knight captures d4, attacks the bishop on the c2, which was protected by bishop to e3, giving up the bishop on the c2 and capturing the knight on the c5. Knight ce6 was played. Wow, white with the pawn on the e5 and a strong knight on the d4 and e6. A good play by Alireza Firouzja with his knight. He is just trying to move up his knight and give a strong play with the e5. Bishop to g6 was then played. Rook f3 attacks the bishop. Bishop back to f6, h6. Knight f5 was played, attacks the bishop. Bishop captures f5, and then after rook captures f5 was played in the game. Bishop e3, rook f3 attacks the bishop. Rook e8, giving up his bishop and attacking the knight on the e6. Rook captures on the e6, rook captures on the e6. Yes, this in-game is better for white because of the pawn on the e5 and the pawn on the h are isolated. Because of this, white is good at his endgame. King g1 was played. Now king is marching towards the center and attacks the rook, going towards the center, and also attacks the rook such that the pawn can be promoted to the queen. King to g7 was played. King f2, king g6 was then played. Rook to e4 such that if kings come to the f5, then there will be rook captures the h4. So here rook to e7 was played. King to f3, king to f5 was played. Giri blundered in his 40 move here and lost the game. He's totally out of control, because here after rook captures on the h4, if rook captures on the e5, that there will be check, and simply rook captures on the e5 or simply captures the pawn on the h7 and win the game easily. Rook captures on the h4 was played, and king captures on the e5. Then after rook to e4, and king have to go back to f6, and rook captures on the e7. King captures on the e7, and yes, of course, this is winning for white because of the pass pawn on the king side. And yes, black has to worry a lot. King to f4 was played, marching towards the ending. King going towards the center and moving forward. King f6 was played. g4, a5 was played, and a4 blocks everything for black here. h6 was then played. h4 trying to exchange the pawn, and if he captures the pawn, and black king has to wait for white pawn, and simply white can march towards the queen side pawn and captures the pawn on the queen side and win the game easily. King e6 was played. g5, h captures g5, h captures king captures g5 was played. Even pawn captures on the g5 will be winning the game, but instead king to g5 was played such that black have to go more far to capture the pawn on the h file. King f7 was then played. King f5, b5 was played. King e5. If black captures the pawn on the a4, then king d6 is coming up to capture the pawn on the c6, and even after that b5 is king b5 and then captures the pawn on the a5 and also on the a4. And here Anish Giri resigned. With his great in-game, Alireza Firouzja win the game with the Anish Giri, Super Grandmaster Anish Giri, and also is leading Tata Steel Master 2020 along with Wesley So. Thank you everyone. If you do like my video, don't forget to subscribe my channel and support me. And if you have any suggestion, please do a comment in the comment below, and also do not forget to like, share, and support. Thank you and bye bye.